حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. Just before I go into the text, I wanted to cover a few things about the methodology of Imam Malik's school. All of the schools, the four schools, and there were many schools when these four were formulated. There was Imam Tabari had a school, Layth had a school, Abu Thawr had a school. There were many different schools, but for whatever reasons, the agreed upon schools became these four schools of Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik's school, Imam Shafi'i, and then Ahmad ibn Hanbal's school, radiyallahu anhum jami'an. So the Imam, thank you. Imam Shafi'i wrote a very important book called the Risala, and in it he set down a methodology for interacting with the Quran and with the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And that methodology, even though he is considered the founder of Usul al-Fiqh, the other ulama were using the methodology. It just hadn't been identified. It's like people speak language and then grammar follows. So Imam Shafi'i, what he did really was, in the same way that Aristotle codified the rules of logic, it wasn't that people, you'll find logic all through Plato's dialogues with Socrates. He's using syllogisms in his reasoning, but Aristotle was the one that identified and gave it names: minor premise, major premise, conclusion. So you'll see that. So Usul al-Fiqh follows the methodologies that were being used, and they had different methodologies. But the first and foremost was the Quran was the primary source for Islamic legislation, and the second was that the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ was the second source, and then the Ijma'. You have the Qiyas and the Ijma'. So Qiyas is using the Quran and the Sunnah and making analogical reasoning. So the ulama divide, for instance, they divide intoxicants and narcotics. You have what are called muskirat, and then you have murqidat, soporifics, and then mukhaddirat or mufsidat, which are narcotics. And they classified each one of these. So, for instance, hashish is not as severe. It's not as severe as alcohol in the Islamic continuum, but it's still considered prohibited because yughayyib al-aql biduni nashwatin wa tarab, the way the fuqaha say it. It causes a clouding of the intellect, but without the same elation and intoxication that you get from alcohol, for instance. So, by analogy then, even though khamr is what's mentioned, and khamr is a muskir, kullu muskirin khamrun wa kullu khamrin haram. You know, every muskir, every intoxicant is a type of khamr. So it doesn't matter if it's from grapes or dates or barley, it doesn't matter what it's from, it goes under that category. But by analogy, the reason is because of the effect that it has on the intellect, on the aql. So by analogy then, drugs become prohibited. And that's how they work with the qiyas. And then the ijma' is what is agreed upon. There's a lot of debate about ijma'. And whether or not there really is an ijma'. But there's definitely an ijma' of the Sahaba about certain things. For instance, when Umar ibn al-Khattab mentioned the Tahiyya, Ibrahimiyya, nobody objected. So, and other examples like that. But within the madhabs, there's definitely an agreed upon opinion about things. And then there's also things that all of the ulama are in agreement upon. For instance, the prohibition of homosexuality. That's mujma' alayh. There's no khilaf about it. So nobody can come, like there's certain modern people that have written articles that in fact, I saw in a book on Islam that was published in England by somebody saying there's nothing in Islam that condemns homosexuality. I mean, anybody can write whatever they want, but that's mujma' alayh. So to deny that then is considered that you're actually outside of Islam. If you deny something that's agreed upon and known out of necessity, like every Muslim knows that. Every Muslim knows alcohol is haram. It's ma'lum min ad-din daruratan. It's just necessarily known. Then if you deny those things, however, if you deny, for instance, that 1/40 of your wealth is an obligation to give, that's not known by necessity. That you have to study fiqh to know that. If you deny zakat, that's one of the 5 pillars, but the actual amount of the zakat is not known by necessity. So that's just ignorance, and somebody's excused for that type of ignorance in terms of takfir. So, but once you get past those 4, you move into the areas that are there's disagreement about them. And Imam Malek uses certain things that the other Imams don't use. And one of them, and this is the most important for you to understand the methodology of the Maliki madhab, one of them is called the Amal of Ahl al-Medina. And Imam Malik considered Medina to have a unique status, that Medina was not like other places. There were 10,000 Sahaba that are buried in Baqi'. It was the place where Abu Bakr and Umar ruled as caliphs, and Uthman radiallahu anhu. So, and part of Imam Ali's khilafah was there until he moved it to Iraq. So Imam Malik considered the ulama, the scholars of Medina, to have a unique perspective on things, because they did not simply read hadith or study hadith, they actually experienced the practice of Islam as an amal, that they were living Islam. Islam was not something like in books that you studied. It was actually things that people experienced. And there's a famous debate with Imam Malik and one of the Iraqi scholars about the actual amount of the sa'a. And Imam Malik just told somebody that was in the gathering to go get his sa'a, the actual physical cup that he used to measure the grain for zakat. And he brought it, and then he said, "Where did you get that?" And he said, "I got it from my father." And he said, "Where did he get it from?" And he got it from one of the Sahaba. So he said, you can debate all you want. We have the measuring tools of the Sahaba, And the same with the adhan. He mentioned that he wasn't interested about what they said about these things. So that aspect of his madhab causes confusion for people. That when you have a sound hadith and the Malikis say, well, we know that hadith, but we don't follow that hadith. Well, إِذَا صَحَ الْحَدِيث فَهُوَ مَذْهَبِي. If the hadith is sound, then it's my madhab. That's what Imam Shafi'i said. Well, that's true, but Imam Shafi'i left certain hadiths that were sahih because they contradicted other hadiths that were sahih. So it's not absolutely true. What Imam Shafi'i was saying is, I'm going to follow the Prophet ﷺ before I follow the opinions of others. Ahmad ibn Hanbal says the same thing. Ahmad ibn Hanbal prefers a weak hadith, which more falls into the category of Hasan in his methodology, but he prefers a weak hadith over the opinions of people. Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu rejects many ahad hadith because they don't follow qawa'id that he firmly believes are established in the Quran. So this idea that you just simply follow the hadith without being able to do tamhis or some kind of gharbala of the hadith, where you put it in a sieve and sort it out. And there's a famous story of Ibn Wahb, who was one of the great scholars of the Maliki madhab, and he's also one of the rijal of Imam al-Bukhari. Ibn Wahb knew just untold numbers of hadith, and he became confused, and he actually said that he memorized so many contrary hadiths that he tahayyart. He said, I became confused. And he said, but thank God for Malek, because he went to Malek and he would say these hadiths and he'd say, leave that hadith, leave that. And he helped him sort out these hadiths. Imam Malik had, Ibn al-Qasim said when after Malik died, he went into his house and found stacks of hadith that he never related. And people used to say to Malik, so-and-so relates that hadith, why don't you relate it? And he said, anybody that relates everything he knows is a fool. In other words, some things Imam Malik did not consider weighty enough for him to teach. If you look at the Muwatta, he spent 40 years honing the Muwatta down, over 40 years. And there's about 1,700 hadith in there, 700 of which are actually not even hadith, but rather sayings of the people of Medina. So Imam Malik was very influenced by the scholars of Medina who believed that the religion was about action, it wasn't about information. And that's why for him, far more important than amassing lots of hadith and knowing all these different opinions was the actual what do we practice, because he really saw the deen as a practical matter. And he was not interested in those type of hair-splitting debates. He disdained asking about things that hadn't occurred. And when people would ask him about things that hadn't occurred, he would ask them, has this occurred? And they would say no. And he said, well, then come back when it's happened, and we'll talk about it. Or when people would want to debate with him, he would say, go to Iraq. Just go, and because they like debate. But in Medina, they don't like debate. He also said that argumentation is not from our religion. Argumentation is not from our religion. He would leave, if people started debating something, he would literally get up and leave. A man came to him once and said, I want to debate you. And he was from the Murji'ah, he was from a sect of Muslims. And Imam Malik knew that he was from that sect, and he said, what do you want to get out of the debate? He said, well, if I win the debate, you follow me. And Malik said, and if I win the debate, he said, I'll follow you. And he said, what if a third person comes and debates us and he beats us? He said, then we follow him. He said, you're going to be on a new religion every day of your life. He said, what I know is what I know, and I'm not interested in debate. So Malik was really, he wasn't looking for something new. He had inherited a school from the Tabi'een who took it from the Sahaba, and he really felt that the corpus was there. It was just a matter of learning it and teaching it and transmitting it. That's how he understood his school. And so one of the reasons why it spread so far and wide was because he was in Medina, and he was known as Al-Alim al-Medina, which is the scholar of Medina. And there's a hadith in Tirmidhi, it's a sound hadith, and the Prophet ﷺ said that there's coming a time soon when people would strike the sides of camels, يَضْرِبُونَ أَكْبَادَ الْإِبْرِ يَطْلُبُونَ الْعِلْمِ, and they'll seek knowledge. And he said, فَلَنْ يَجِدُوا أَعْلَمَ مِنْ عَالِمِ الْمَدِينَةِ. They won't find anybody more knowledgeable than the scholar of Medina. And the ulama of the time said, we understood it to be Malik, because there was nobody that got that laqab, that nickname, other than Malik. And another thing that's very interesting about Malik, and it's one of my favorite stories about him, that he had a rival who was another muhaddith, who Malik didn't really like very much, and the other man didn't like Malik. It was kind of a mutual thing. But he said about when Imam Malik wrote the Muwatta, and he called it the Muwatta, which means the well-trodden path. This is the way that many people have gone before. When he wrote the Muwatta, he put it out, and it had an amazing acceptance. Well, people started writing Muwattas, and somebody came to him and he said, "Katharat al-Muwatta'at." There's a lot of Muwattas now. Like, you started this thing, and now there's a whole bunch of Muwattas. And Imam Malik said, he didn't say anything other than, he said, "Ma kana lillah dama wattasal, wa ma kana li ghayri la inqata' wa infasal." what's for Allah will continue on and remain, and what is for other than Allah is severed and cut off. So, I mean, he was pretty much just leaving it to, if I was sincere in this, Allah will give it tawfiq, and if I wasn't, then it won't get that tawfiq. So it doesn't matter what people do. In the end, it's whether Allah accepts it or not, and that was his view about it. So the Muwatta is not the basis of the madhab. It definitely has a lot of the opinions. It has some opinions that are actually not Malik's opinions. Sometimes he points them out, other times he doesn't. For instance, people that argue for qabd argue that the qabd is in the Muwatta, but in the Mudawwana, which is the authoritative book of Malik's fiqh, they don't have qabd, it has sadr. So that's an example. But Imam Malik would use, he put in the Muwatta several hadiths to show people that he knew the hadith, and that he despite that, he wasn't using the hadith. So another example is the masalih, which Imam Malik focuses on maslaha more than the other imams. So he believes that the sharia is essentially there to serve human beings, and things that are beneficial to human beings that can rationally be discerned should be incorporated into the law. And that's why public welfare is so important in his madhab, what's called maslaha. He also because he has an immense amount of wara', and Sha'rani says his imam is Umari. It's really following the madhab of Sayyidina Umar. He also has what's called sadda dharaya, which is to cut off pretexts. When he worries something will lead to something else, he might have a legal ruling that in normal circumstances wouldn't contain that ruling. So an example of that is Imam Malik considered it makruh to fast the 6 days immediately after Ramadan, after the Eid. And the reason that he did is he said that he was afraid that people would actually consider that part of Ramadan. So that's cutting off that pretext, sadda dharaya, that he does. Istihsan, which is equity, is another aspect of his madhab, where sometimes he will prefer a position that follows the spirit of the law more than a position that follows the letter of the law, because sometimes following the letter of the law can actually lead to an unjust ruling. And so when he sees that, he'll actually move towards a ruling that is closer to the maqasid, or the spirit of the law. So Ibn Ashir basically gives us there was one story I wanted to. Yeah, another aspect of the sadda dharaya is that he prohibits the selling of weapons when there's civil strife. So it's actually haram to sell. Normally it's permissible to sell weapons, but when there's civil strife, when people are actually killing each other, he says it's haram, because he's cutting off the pretext of that. He also prohibits giving gifts to public officials. So you can't give a gift to somebody who's in a government position, just as here, Merry Christmas or something, because of the possibility for corruption, and then that person feeling like they owe you a favor, because that's the nature of gift giving, is that people feel indebted to you. And he has several other examples of that. But Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, of all the Imams, I think probably the distinguishing factor in Malik is that he is uniquely, from the Imams that have become canonical, he is uniquely the only one that is considered a master muhaddith and a master faqih. None of them have that status. Abu Hanifa was a muhaddith, but he was not at the level of Imam Malik. He's not, even Ahmed ibn Hanbal, who was a muhaddith, his musnad contains many weak hadiths, and he did not have the critical. Why isn't there a Hanbali class where? In the camp? Is there any Hanbalis? You're Hanbali? Well, you're definitely a minority. I mean, I know, we can't, it's hard to serve. We don't have, there's very few Hanbalis. I mean, in the Muslim world, there's a handful of Hanbalis in Syria and in Palestine. And then there's Hanbalis in Saudi Arabia and in Kuwait and a few in Qatar. And that's pretty much it. So the majority of Muslims that we serve are Hanafi, Shafi'i, and Maliki. We don't, Ahmed ibn Hanbal is an Imam, but it's just there's not a lot of Hanbalis. So I mean, I think you'd have to go maybe to Saudi Arabia or something and find a teacher. Because I don't know any Hanbali teachers in the U.S. And I know one student of the Hanbali madhab from the Americans. He lives in the Emirates. Other than that, we don't have trained teachers that could even teach the Hanbali madhab. Yeah. So, yeah, Imam Ahmed was a master of hadith, but his fiqh is not at the level of Imam Malek. And the same is true for Imam Shafi'i, who was a faqih and a master of fiqh, but his hadith is not. And this is what Qadi Iyad points out in Tartib al-Madarik, that Imam Malik uniquely had that mastery of these two fundamental sciences. Exactly, that's the way they look at it. They, like Imam Ahmed was muhaddith faqih, Imam Shafi is faqih muhaddith, Abu Hanif is faqih muhaddith, but Imam Malik goes both ways. Yeah, he goes both ways with equal dexterity. He's the only one that has that maqam. And that's agreed upon. Nobody debates that. Now, the other thing about Imam Malik radiallahu anhu is that he did not teach hadith in his fiqh class. So he actually didn't mention hadith in his fiqh class. If you go through the Muwatta, he doesn't mention hadith. And that's very important because one of the things that people say about fiqh is like, where's your dalil? This is a very modern kind of thing. What's your dalil? Fiqh was not taught with dalil. The dalil was the faqih that was teaching the fiqh. Like Imam Malik is the dalil. You don't know hadith without Imam Malik. And to learn hadith and fiqh, you have to study usul. You can't, because it's not simply here's your dalil. Sometimes the dalil is very subtle. It's not, sometimes the dalil relates to the fact, like for instance, Abu Huraira is a muhaddith, but he's not a faqih. Abu Huraira rarely gave fatwa. He did give fatwa, but rarely. So when Abu Huraira has a hadith that has fiqh in it, the imams will not necessarily take that hadith. For instance, Abu Huraira used to do his wudu up into his arm, because the Prophet ﷺ said to Yazidu fi ghurratihi, like if you, that on Yawm al-Qiyamah, the people of wudu are known, they're ghur muhajjalun. They come with white arms and white faces and white feet. So the Prophet knows them through that. So the Prophet ﷺ said about doing the hadith that to increase in your ghurra. So Abu Huraira understood that to mean to go beyond the elbow. None of the other Sahaba understood that. So the Imam Malik said that's not what it means. It means to do wudu on top of wudu. It doesn't mean to go, because the sunnah is to go up to the elbow. There's no hadith that indicate the Prophet. So there's an example of a Sahabi who understood something, but his fiqh of that hadith And Aisha corrected Abu Huraira in several instances. In fiqh, like she said, he misunderstood the hadith. So Abu Huraira was a transmitter of hadith and not necessarily a faqih. The way that the ulama understand this is that they say the muhaddith is like the pharmacist and the faqih is the doctor. The pharmacist gives the medicine, but it's the faqih that prescribes it. And so the muhaddith is not really somebody who's necessarily understands the fiqh of what he's teaching.